After watching that last video, I realized that it kind of looked like I had on a goofy looking scarf, but it's just a hoodie. Don't worry. Um, in case you're wondering, this stuff is super important. That's why I've decided to put it on here twice. Here we're going to start getting into this week's content, right? Actually diving into chapter 4. Before we can talk about what energy is needed during exercise, what we really need to talk about is what energy is needed at rest, because we spend the majority of our lives resting. Very rarely are we like sprinting or running or whatever for days and days and days at times. Actually, probably never, most of us. If you're an ultra runner, then you're crazy and you don't, I don't know. Yeah, I got all that. So really the primary thing I think we talked about during the first week is that everything comes back to homeostasis. Essentially, at the end of the day, everything comes back to homeostasis, which is this like steady and unchanging state that our body prefers to have. It's got a very specific temperature it likes. It's got a very specific pH that it likes. Very specific energy state, all these different things. Our body is essentially like a cat. It's pretty clever. I just came up with that all on my own. Essentially, our bodies are like cats, right? Like they're super particular about what they do and they don't like. They're probably not going to hop up on your desk and swat stuff off, but yeah, cats are jerks anyways. At rest, what you kind of need to know is that nearly 100% of our energy needs are going to be met by aerobic metabolism. So we're going to actually be burning quite a bit of fat, and we're kind of just going to be using the electron transport chain because we're not really stressing our body. We're not really putting ourselves in an energy crunch, if you will. We're really not needing fast energy. Essentially, our body has been designed for a couple of different things. But if you tend to think about the human body ancestrally, if you tend to think about it evolutionarily, essentially our body is built for a couple of good things. One is to fight the lion, and one is to run away from the lion, or one is to fight Godzilla, and one is to run away from Godzilla. Essentially, we're kind of always trying to, when we're at rest, we're trying to preserve the ability to fight or run from Godzilla. Similar things kind of play in when we start getting into nutrition status of the human body. Everything comes back to fight or flight, and kind of whether or not our body needs rapid onset energy in huge adrenaline dumps, or whether or not we need to just sustain what we're doing and recover. At rest, you're going to tend to have a very low lactate reading. And for right now, all I need you to know is that lactate specifically is just symbolic of the fact that you're using primarily aerobic energy metabolism. We'll go over in later slide decks this week about what lactate specifically is, but for this slide, lactate just means that you're at rest. This is a bunch of ways for me to tell you that at rest, you're resting and you're using predominantly aerobic energy sources. This slide gets a little bit nuanced, but what I'm trying to do is just show you essentially what our oxygen consumption looks like when we're at rest. So one important concept that you need to learn now, and you'll go back to in exercise testing and prescription and all those different things, is that relative VO2. So VO2 is the volume of oxygen that our body is consuming and utilizing at one time. I have that definition later, but for like essentially VO2 just means it's how much we're bringing in and how much oxygen our body's actually using. So at rest, the average size young adult, which is about 70 kilograms or very roughly 150 pounds, 1 pound times 2.2 gets you kilograms, but it's about 3.5 mLs per kg per minute. So that's 3.5 milliliters per kilogram of tissue per minute that our body is using of oxygen. That ends up equating out to about 2.25 liters per minute. So these are two different ways of expressing oxygen consumption. There is a relative oxygen consumption and there's an absolute oxygen consumption. Relative is the one that is using the mLs per kg per minute, whereas absolute is not taking into account body mass, body size. And why that's important is that a bigger individual is going to have a larger lung volume more often than not. So they're going to be able to take in higher levels of oxygen or breathe in larger volumes or larger quantities. Whereas if you use not whereas, but essentially having that high lung volume means that it will artificially inflate the VO2 of the individual, or it will artificially inflate their ability to pull oxygen out, if you will. So relative VO2 max, or VO2, is one that accounts for body weight, so that we can compare an individual that's Yao Ming size, or like 7 foot something, to someone that's like my wife's height, who's 5 foot barely. So that's really the big difference between relative and absolute. The one metabolic equivalent, or one MET, is equal to 3.5 mLs per kg. And what one MET signifies is complete and utter rest. As you continue to build up in your energy expenditure, say you go from laying on a bed to rocking in a rocking chair, to standing up, to walking to get a vacuum, to vacuuming, to climbing the stairs with a vacuum. At each one of those points, you're going to be increasing the amount of oxygen that you're consuming, and you're going to be breathing heavier, right? And your heart rate's going to go up, and that is essentially the increasing metabolic equivalence, or the increasing oxygen consumption that's going on. So that's what this page is really trying to represent, is that there is a bunch of different metabolic levels. So there's a bunch of different stages of metabolic activity, or stages of activity and intensity, if you will. Think like, where's a good example here? Something that's super, super light. So archery, right? Drawing a bow and pulling back a bow and releasing the arrow is about 3.5 MET. So you're about 3.5 times resting state. You're working 3.5 times harder, essentially, when you're shooting archery versus when you're laying on a bed. Same thing with, if you look at skateboarding or downhill skiing, each one of those things is going to be continually increasing the amount of oxygen that your body's consuming and utilizing. So what does this really mean, right? Like, why do I care? Well, essentially there is a rest to exercise transition. There is a period of time where you have like Instagram versus reality in terms of what's going on with the body. And essentially what you have is, at the onset of exercise, you have a stored amount of ATP, but your body hasn't kind of kicked up and is revving and ready to go to produce all the ATP. So if we had no ability to kind of offset energetic needs with stored ATP, we would look like this kid over here on the left-hand side of the screen, right? Like, as soon as you start moving, or as soon as you try to jump on a treadmill, you're done. However, the fact that we have stored ATP, and the fact that we have systems like the phosphocreatine system or fast glycolysis, we can actually jump on the treadmill and start running at 25 miles an hour. Well, some of us can. And that's what I'm trying to represent in these graphs right here, right? Same exact concept, but now we're looking at it in a graph form. So follow the cursor, and you can see that here on the bottom, or on the X axis, we have a time domain, if you will. So it's like -2 minutes, -1 minute, exercise initiation. Don't pay attention to that. Exercise initiation at that 0 time point. So that's hopping on the treadmill immediately. And that's that speed requirement right here, right? So you can see that at time of change of speed, at time of hopping on the treadmill, we go from 0 to immediately a rate of speed. Over on the right hand, or over on kind of panel on B, same x-axis, however a y-axis has changed. And what I want you to be following here is that this is no longer speed. This is going to be the amount of ATP use that is required for the energy that is, or for the physiological demand that is occurring, or for the exercise that's occurring. So you can track this purple line here, right? -2 minutes before we hop on the treadmill, nothing. -1 minute before we hop on the treadmill, nothing. We're just using ATP for standing, which is what this dotted line is. And then immediately at minute 0, we have an onset of a rapid need for ATP, or a rapid need for energy. And that's what this top purple line right here is representing, is this is how much ATP is needed to meet the supply, or to meet the demand with a supply, if you will. Panel C is really what's occurring within the body. So hypothetical, change of speed and how we need to meet speed. Hypothetical, how we need to meet the energy for the speed. C is what's really occurring inside of the body. So this kind of green faded out section right here is actually going to be the transition period, or the rest to exercise transition. This is kind of colloquially termed the O2 deficit. And if you can see that purple line, or that green line, the green line as it's going up, it's a slow climb. At minute 0, when we hop on that treadmill, our VO2, our oxygen consumption, our ability to produce ATP via aerobic metabolism is not quite where it needs to be. And if you look, it's actually not until about minute 3 or 4 that we're able to be meeting the aerobic demand of oxygen, or not the aerobic demand of ATP, And why that's so important, or why that correlates with last week, or why it tracks with last week, is what's occurring in this 1 to 2 minute time frame. What's occurring in that 1 to 2 minute domain? Well, phosphocreatine and glycolysis, right? Like, that's why we learn that stuff first, is because you need to understand how we're getting the energy during this O2 deficit period, and then also with the aerobic metabolism, you need to understand how we're maintaining this. So what you see in that figure is that the O2 consumption does not increase instantaneously, right? It is curvilinear. There is an O2 deficit, or there is at least a time period where our aerobic metabolism is not able to meet our energetic demands. So there's almost like a lag, right, in the ability of our aerobic system to match the energetic requirements. In B, what you're looking at is the ATP production from phosphocreatine system, right? So how much ATP is being produced from phosphocreatine? If we're dropping phosphocreatine amounts and concentrations, then we're understandably dropping the amount of ATP that's being created from that phosphocreatine, right? Like, we're sapping our stores, we're eating all the grain, we're running out of generation potential because we're using it. If you go to figure C, or you go to panel C on this figure, you can see that, I just said C like 17 times. If you go to panel C, there it was again. If you go to panel C, dang, all right. If you look here, there's a slow rise in the amount, or the rate of glycolysis that's occurring. So it's the rate of ATP that's being produced. So as we're dropping phosphocreatine production, as we're dropping ATP production from the phosphocreatine system, we're going to be compensating by increasing the ATP from glycolysis, right? We have a level of ATP that we need to maintain for the exercise activity, but phosphocreatine can't do it for forever. Glycolysis is making up for it, right? It's serving as a point guard. It's serving an assistance goal. It's kind of the assist in the goal scoring, if you will. Once you hit a certain point, once you hit a couple of minutes of activity, you'll actually see that the glycolysis, or the glycolytic ATP generation, is reducing as well. And why is that? If we think about it, we've still got a drop in phosphocreatine, and we've still got essentially a drop in, now we have a drop in glycolysis. What's making up that difference? Well, it's going to be that aerobic phosphagen, or the aerobic phosphorylation. It's going to be aerobic metabolism that's starting to take over here and really starting to drive the majority, or the bulk, of the ATP production. Something that I do want you guys to notice over here is that you actually have this not growth, but you kind of have this point of metabolism where glycolysis is always running. If you notice here that it's not at 0. If it was at 0, that would mean that it was shut off. Same thing with that phosphocreatine system over here. It never hits a 0 point. It's dropping and then it's returning. So we actually have these energy systems running all the time. They're just running in the background. So when it comes to this concept of O2 deficit, when it comes to this concept of trying to reach a steady state, there's really two main hypotheses. One is that some of the muscles and some of the mitochondria just flat out don't have oxygen. They don't have the ability to create ATP from oxidative phosphorylation. And that's possible, but what seems to be the more leading hypothesis is that there's a level of signaling that's occurring. So there's actually, within those systems, within phosphocreatine, within glycolysis, within the oxidative phosphorylation, which is Krebs cycle and electron transport chain, there is intermediates, or there's enzymes, or there's signals such as NADH that's going to actually be controlling how fast you're moving towards the electron transport chain and how fast you're moving towards oxidative phosphorylation. And those kind of signals, those gatekeepers, if you will, are slow to open the gates to everyone. They're slow to open the gates, and that means that there's a lag in how long it takes for this steady state to be achieved when it's possible. On the flip side of the O2 deficit is this concept of EPOC. And EPOC, we'll go over it in like I think the next slide or 2 slides, is excessive post-exercise oxygen consumption. So what it is it's the time period where your metabolism hasn't returned back to baseline. So it's that slow, gradual return back to baseline. It's the reason why you're still hyperventilating after a hard workout. It's the reason why if you're riding your bike to class or you're walking to class, you kind of get to class and you're still maybe slightly out of breath if you're a fatty like me, or you're still kind of sweating and your heart rate's still a little bit elevated from climbing up the stairs or whatever. This is what's going on. It's this excessive post-exercise oxygen consumption. It's the time period in which your metabolic rate and metabolic activity and ATP need is still elevated after exercise. That need for ATP after exercise is going to be significantly greater from high intensity exercise. So the harder you work out, the more intense the exercise is, the more you're going to have to, like, the longer it's going to take you to return back to a complete baseline, if that makes sense. So the further you deviate up and above from homeostasis, the longer it's going to take you to return back down to a homeostatic baseline, or back down to that set point or that resting point. So what's unique about non-steady state exercise or really intense exercise that's not maintainable is that you're exercising at a rate that is above the capacity for aerobic metabolism. You're exercising at a rate that is not sustainable. And so it's actually going to drive your metabolism a little bit harder. It's going to drive your body temperature up a little bit more. It's going to drive your respiration up a little bit more. And that means it's going to take you a little bit longer to return back to baseline. So what's going on with this EPOC? What exactly is it? Well, historically it's been thought of as a oxygen debt. And what oxygen debt was, or what the theory or what the hypothesis, I guess, behind oxygen debt was, is that it was a replacement for all of the ATP generated during the front end, during that O2 deficit, during the time it takes to hit steady state. And really the thought is that this section of light blue right here, the amount of ATP that was missed on the front end, is being made up on the back end. Maybe not necessarily the most accurate. What we're seeing now is this shift towards the use of the term EPOC. And that's kind of like the afterburn, if you will, right? What we did is we eliminated the concept of a repayment of the debt. So it's no longer like you're trying to pay back all the energy. It's really for trying to restore some of the phosphocreatine stores that are in muscle, and it's also trying to provide oxygen and provide a means for the energetic demands that are occurring within the heart and the cardiovascular system and the cardiopulmonary system. So it's trying to kind of provide a means to return our body back to a homeostatic point, if that makes sense. So why would it then be higher after high intensity exercise? Well, if we're kind of thinking through this rationally, we know that a high intensity exercise is going to put us at a higher work rate. It's going to put us at a non-sustainable work rate, and it's going to take and put our body further out of homeostasis than we would like it. So it's going to serve as a pretty big stress to our body that our body's not exactly ready for. And so it results in higher heat productions, and that means that you have to return your heat back to a normal level. You have greater depletion of the phosphocreatine system. So the harder you work and the longer your non-sustainable exercise, then the more the phosphocreatine system is going to be contributing, and the more you have to kind of get that back and get and recover or buffer that loss, if you will. You have higher blood lactate levels, which you're trying to return and kind of convert back into glucose and some other things, which we'll talk about later. And then you also have higher hormone levels associated with the exercise. So your stress hormones are going to be significantly elevated, even higher than they would be if it was prolonged exercise. In order to return back to normal, you kind of have to delay, or you have a greater effort to return back to normal and kind of get everything back in line, if you will. So what's going on metabolically with a short duration, high intensity exercise? Well, this first 2 bullet points, you guys already know. I know you know it. We've talked about it 100 times already. What's driving these metabolic responses? Well, the duration and the intensity, right? It makes sense. If we're going to be doing short duration, high intensity exercise, we're going to be relying on the phosphagen system and the glycolytic system some. What is really interesting for you guys to kind of look at is these last 3 bullet points. As you start going over 45 seconds, as you start kind of getting towards the end of that fast glycolysis system, you're really going to see that you're using all 3 energy systems. And that's really the first time that you can really observe it. And it's really the first time that it's very, very apparent, I guess I should say. So like exercise that's 60 seconds or longer, think a 800 meter, you're going to be using about 70% anaerobic and 30% aerobic energy systems. So it's about a minute and a half, 2-minute exercise. That's what you're looking at. CrossFitters, you're looking at a really fast Fran, or I guess a really slow Fran if you're actually a good CrossFitter. And then when you're in that kind of franny time, I guess it's an adjective now, you're looking at about 50-50 split. So it's about 50% aerobic and 50% anaerobic. What about the longer duration, lower intensity? Well, it's going to be driven by intensity. It's going to be driven by how far you're putting yourself outside of homeostasis, right? All of our responses to exercise are driven by how far we're pushing ourselves away from baseline. If we're using steady state exercise, it means it's submaximal, which means we're not pushing ourselves that far out of homeostasis. It's still a good ways, but it's not as far as high intensity exercise would be. Where this changes is when the environment changes or the conditions change, so that we push ourselves even further outside of homeostasis, right? So think hot, humid environments. Think exercising in Georgia, running hills, or going for a jog on campus during the summer when it's 95 degrees out, 95% humidity. What's happening to your body? You're huffing, you're puffing, you're breathing a lot harder. The workout's harder. And you actually see this cardiovascular and respiratory drift. So you're actually going to see that heart rate continues to kind of climb throughout this exercise. Respiration kind of continues to climb throughout this exercise. And you never really hit a clean, steady state. And that means that you're not going to be able to have this consistent work output that's occurring. If you're working too heavy, if you're working at a level that's really 75, 80% or greater, it's not going to be a sustainable exercise. Even though it's lower intensity, even though it's a prolonged duration, it's still going to have higher contributions from the anaerobic energy systems. It's going to have more contributions from PCR. It's going to have more contributions from the fast glycolysis.